Hello and welcome to the Agora Politics podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Anna. Anna, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for welcoming me to the show.
Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. And we're going to get into our main topic today, which is your work with the Global Redesign Institute. But first, I wanted to ask you some things a little bit about where this idea came from. So you have some introductory videos and various things that you've recorded to try to get people more familiarized with Global Redesign Institute. But how do you self-conceptualize the project?
Okay, that's a really good question. Well, I guess me thinking about it all kind of, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. You're all good.
I hear myself weird, but cool. The whole thing started when I was at a Zeitgeist. Are you familiar with the Zeitgeist movement at all?
No, not as a movement.
Okay, but you watch the movies.
I mean, I know what zeitgeist means. I don't know anything
Well,
else
then
about it.
that's pretty much all you have to know. It's,
Okay.
it means the spirit of the times, right?
Mhm.
So I was at an event which was all about kind of moving the spirit of the times towards a higher degree of functionality in terms of public health. And at this event was this activist named Peter Joseph, and he gave a presentation on Project Cybersyn and Stafford Beer. Are you familiar with Project Cybersyn?
No, not entirely. I was introduced to it when I was looking into your work, and that's my first time hearing about it.
Oh, okay. Well, it's super cool. Basically, I think it was something in the 80s in Chile, and this guy called Stafford Beer was trying to create this system of which would facilitate direct democracy by making all regional data accessible to the members of the community in question.
Mhm.
And the idea with that would be that then people could vote directly on policy, as opposed to, which I think is called referendums. Am I right? When the people are voting directly on policy, but while also having all of that information to, in that way, give their informed consent instead of the goddamn mess we have today. And so I was very, very interested by that, and that's kind of what got the ball rolling for me. Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you this about this word you have then that's related to Project Cybersyn, which is Dymaxyn.
Yeah.
So this is described as a transitional step on the way to economic emancipation of communities and
Mm.
the liberation of all classes from access inequality and its resulting social problems.
Yes.
This word is a combination of the words Cybersyn as well as Dymaxion. And Dymaxion is another word which comes from Buckminster Fuller, I believe,
Mhm.
which means the dynamic maximum tension. So it's
Yes.
sort of a way of doing things that, from my understanding, is trying to eke out the maximum amount of efficiency in terms of your application of force and the result that comes out of that. Um,
Yes.
do you want to just describe what the word Dymaxyn, how this related to your conception of the work that the Global Redesign Institute is doing?
Well, I chose the name because I thought the Global Redesign Institute was a bit of a mouthful, and also because that is associated with a sort of a pre-existing concept that I actually was not terribly familiar with when I got involved with it. I had just been making like I think many people in their own communities, I've just sort of been wandering around looking at things and imagining how they could be optimized. And I did a little video about it. And the next day, someone was like, "Oh, hey, can you speak about the Global Redesign Institute at our event?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure. What's that?" And so I kind of started working on my own kind of understanding of what I thought it could be. And the result is the project that I'm here to talk about today. But then somewhere along the line, I realized that sort of like a previous discourse around the name had already kind of started to happen. So I thought I should come up with a new name. And I am a big fan of Buckminster Fuller. And I see a kind of a beautiful tragedy in some of the things that he would say about, because he had things so clear in his mind and never really got to see those ideas take hold in a dominant way. And so I chose that word not just because of the meaning, of course, but I wanted to choose a word which had to do with Buckminster Fuller, to sort of pull my idea of him and the meme of functional equality that he sought to perpetuate into the present and into what I'm trying to do here. And then, and then the sin at the end of that is a nod to Project Cybersyn and all that it sought to create, because it's unclear to me whether Stafford Beer, the Project Cybersyn guy, was trying to get everyone to a point where we could be, voting directly in referendums with all of the data required to do so in a responsible and informed way, or whether his angle was like, if all of the people in the communities have the data, then they can choose to elect political officials in a more informed and consenting way. Either way, I think the first idea is the more functional in terms of the integrity of the democracy in the community in question. But that was really the first time that anybody that I know of took a stab, like a meaningful stab, at attaining a level of like access and what's like the opposite of disenfranchisement.
I mean, you could just say enfranchisement or
okay,
participation or stake even.
All great ones. Yeah, well, the first time that somebody took a stab at elevating the level of enfranchisement and equality through, a very technical way that seems to deal directly with the things which are coming in between communities and public health and equality.
So one of the other taglines that's sort of associated with this concept here is to facilitate what you call structural satire, and I'm probably going to butcher this. Structural satyagraha, the design.
That was awesome. Can you try that one more time?
Sure. Structural satyagraha.
I like it.
Is that correct?
Why not? Sure. Say satyagraha.
Why don't you tell us how you pronounce it so the listeners know?
I'd say satyagraha.
Satyagraha. Okay.
But words are just words, and it's fun to play around with them and make them our own.
So the design and implementation of infrastructure, which supports and rewards nonviolent behavior. What is the connection between nonviolence and its incentivization that you're talking about with structural satyagraha, and the broader goal of establishing Dymaxyn?
I think that's a really great question, and a complex and challenging question. So hopefully I'm going to be as efficient at answering it as I think I'm going to have fun answering it, if that makes sense. So the connection between the two, well, basically Dymaxyn is an educational platform is how it would start, which seeks to train communities to kind of step into their power in terms of agency and enfranchisement with regard to the development of the infrastructure which supports the communities. So particularly in an economic sense, where economics means, literally originally derives from the word oikonomia, which is Greek for management of the household. Not like the weird bastardization, which is all like numbers and debt. Like that's not real economics, that's debt economics, that's trash economics. Nobody's interested in that. That shit's obsolete. But so Dymaxyn is seeking to economically empower communities, and that's why the idea behind that is all of the regional data being made available. People can then see like what's going where and make choices about, I want, like, okay, well, which method of manufacturing, whatever thing that we as a community decide we need, whatever type of infrastructure it could be, whether it's a waste disposal system, an agricultural system, or an educational system, when we're laying the infrastructure to create these institutions, these things, these features of our economy, where are we going to source our resources from? What is the most regenerative and sustainable practice in which we can that we can use to build, basically.
Mm.
And and in this way, we're dealing with the allocation of resources. And with an open source and open access economy where all data is available, most things can be automated. I mean, that's just the reality we live in today. But with the idea of most things being automated and most economic information being open access and open source, we really set the stage for a potentially very egalitarian community with a very high level of public health, because it will be very easy for people within the community who want their community to have a high level of public health to allocate resources in such a way which facilitates that. And it's in the best interest of everybody in the community. And then, so that's why why I coined the term structural satyagraha, because it's the idea of coding nonviolence into an economy. And of course, economy is the foundation of culture.
So by nonviolence, then you mean not just the absence of physical violence, but also other forms of economic coercion. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I forget who it was, but it was probably Gandhi, because he was the one who invented, or who coined the term satyagraha. Because funnily enough, even in Sanskrit, which I think is one of the oldest languages that we have on record as humans, we don't have a word for nonviolence other than the negation of a pre-existing concept. In Sanskrit, we have ahimsa, which is the opposite of himsa. So it just means like no harm, whereas himsa is harm. And when Gandhi was coining the term satyagraha, what that means is the force of truth. So it's not just sort of being passive and submitting, but rather to go forward in a way which elevates the whatever the truth may be in that situation. And that takes into account the idea that the fundamental truth of all people is cooperation, really, because that's what's elevating us to be the best that we can be, to really step into our power as individuals and communities, to attain greatness in a way which also uplifts the planet. When everything's working together, that's the one. When everything's all competitive and shit's falling apart and everything's on fire, that's not the one. That's not like the ultimate truth of us. Although, a pessimist and perhaps a realist would say that, perhaps that is going to be the truth that we're left with, but it's not the ultimate one. And so I use structural satyagraha because it's this idea of public health, that all that stuff that I just talked about, that's a very high level of public health in the sense of a community, but also in the sense of the global community. So it's the idea of the support and the implementation of infrastructure which upholds public health, and then framing it in that context of nonviolence, the force of truth. It really brings to mind, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Pickett's work, who wrote The Spirit Level, but are you?
I'm not totally familiar with it. I mean, I've heard of it. That's better.
Okay, cool. Well, basically the idea, like in that book, there's a lot of studies detailing and showing how high levels of income inequality are directly correlated to high instances of violence and antisocial behavior, and basically a very low level of public health. So it's this idea that economic equality supports and upholds a very sound culture and a high level of public health.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I'm struggling with as far as terminology right now is this use of the phrase public health. It's triggering all these associations that are actually rather negative for me right now, just given the circumstances.
Tell me
But
about that.
I understand like more broadly what you're getting at. What I mean by that is just it seems to me as if um, the institution of public health is sort of rooted in a particular kind of ideology, which is that you can sort of propagandize a population into compliant behavior, and that this compliant behavior is dictated by a sort of top-down planning of what a group of usually technocrats might think is best for them, or that they should be doing. And given the public health failures, not only in the United States but also in other places around the world with the pandemic that's now an endemic, I think that's a word that has just come to have so much pollution involved in it that it's very hard to talk about these problems using that exact phrase. But anyway, this is just semantics.
No, that's actually really I'm really glad you brought that up. I have a response to that. Are you cool for me to
Go
respond to
ahead.
that? All right, awesome. So yeah, I mean they hijacked it, didn't they? The bastards. They hijacked public health. And just like they hijacked economy, economy deriving from the Greek oikonomia, management of the household, supposed to be management of the household, right? Done effectively, that means that every room in the house is well furnished, well heated, etc. But what have we got? What have we got? We've got a situation where we are depleting the resources from all of the household to over furnish the attic to the point of collapse. So they hijacked that one too. They hijacked democracy. There's
Mm,
nothing democratic about voting. There's an ambiguity there that we don't have to dive into, but about the process of voting for people who all went to the same school, who've probably never set foot in your neighborhood, and if they did, it was just to get out, throw some trash at a beggar and get back into their limo. And then they're deciding what kind of policies affect your neighborhood. No, that's nonsense. That's trash. That's not democracy. And the same for public health. Public health is something that needs to be determined by the level of satisfaction. And I don't just mean emotional satisfaction, but in terms of needs, human needs being satisfied, being met, of the community. It's not just some abstraction that people can kind of vomit at you, and we have to accept that. So that's nonsense.
mm,
And but all that happens when these terms get hijacked for the greater evil is that we have to come up with new ones. And that's fine. That's the kind of beautiful dance of oppression and an uprising of control and domination and liberty. And that's a beautiful cycle if we can find it in our hearts to enjoy ourselves and not get demoralized and stay creative, which of course is difficult to do when you're locked into a 9 to 5, and your rent and the livelihoods of your children are on the line. You're stuck in survival mode. It's a lot harder to get into creative mode. But we got to try, right?
yeah, definitely. And one of the other methods you can use to sort of get around this is reappropriating these terms, right? So
Mm.
by the use of our public health in this discourse right now, we are in a way trying to attempt to remove it from those more negative associations that have laid claim to it, right? Of course, maybe you have positive associations if you're, for example, working in public health right now. You probably think it's great and that you're doing a good job, and we shouldn't discount the people who are doing honest, good work there. That being said, this is another tool that we can use. There's also reappropriation. I was listening to the Kanye West's new Donda album last night, and one of the tracks on that is named "No Child Left Behind," which of course was a disastrous educational policy implemented by the Bush administration.
I don't
Um,
know about that. Will you tell me about that, please?
the policy "No Child Left Behind."
Yeah.
Sure. So no Child Left Behind, briefly, was just an educational policy that was implemented during George W. Bush's presidency by the Department of Education to sort
Mm.
of an attempt to bring American school children up to certain standards. And so it had good intentions, as most education policies presumably do.
Presumably.
Yeah, the negative consequence of it, which is why it's not generally regarded as a great policy, is that what happened is this attempt at mass standardization from a centralized point, which is the Federal Department of Education, caused the institution of widespread standardized testing at all levels of grade school curricula.
I
And
see.
even though standardized testing is something that I'm generally in favor of at higher levels, like college entrance and going into high school, there are important factors that we can determine through standardized testing. Implementing it developmentally at every single stage of one's educational career is a huge problem, not least because of the fact that children develop at different rates. And so if you're expecting them all at the same age to be performing the same way, then what you can have happening over time is you can have students who maybe would be educationally adequate or sufficient, throughout the average of their educational career, believing at various points that they're inadequate or they're stupid or they're doing not as well as their peers because of the fact that they're on a different developmental trajectory. That is for the time being. All this is, I don't care too much to go into the pros and cons of No Child Left Behind. If you've got an opinion on it, go ahead. I was just reminded last night when I was listening to that song that he had taken this term and he had done this with a number of other things, and ripped it from its original context where it was this, this particular educational program. And then he used it in this song where it wasn't really about that at all. And so you can play this game of sort of reassociating if you reappropriate terms.
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting point. Did you know that, I forget the year it was made, but a kids film. Remember those little trolls that you'd get in Happy Meals?
Mm-hmm.
You know how they made a kids movie about which like brought the trolls to life in all of their wonderful world?
Yeah, that was a
Well,
weird movie.
it was a weird movie, very uplifting, and as in the kind of cool psychedelic way that children's movies are becoming in over the last decade, I've noticed anyway. But anyway, in the Trolls movie, they have this bit where they're like, no troll left behind. And it's, talking about like the community and the solidarity between the trolls. So, that's pretty cool. Uh, just as an aside, I think I'm glad that you brought that up about the standardized testing, because it brings into focus that idea of sameness versus equality. Did you ever see that picture of like, oh, like there are three people and they're all different heights and they're trying to look over a fence to see something happening, and sameness comes along and says, oh, here, look, you can all have the same height block. And of course, it's no good for the shorter people. But then equality comes along and it's like, look, you can have the block which is appropriate to your needs. And something that we can see there is like there does tend to be this confusion, doesn't there, even in 2012, this idea, the confusion of the ideas of sameness and equality. For example, the whole like empowering woman movement that we've seen over the last however many years, that whole like hashtag girl boss, really just seems to be you know giving women the chance to be as ruthless and horrible as people assigned masculine at birth have been forced into that role. And it's like, oh great, now you can be traumatized in this in this masculine way as well. And it's all just different shades of dysfunction, and yet we're calling it equality. So it's no wonder that we have such a that communication has become so difficult. And of course, when communication becomes difficult, it's hard for us to cooperate. Another point that I want to bring up in response to what you said is that idea of testing. And we don't have to get into that right now, actually, maybe because you said you want to talk a bit about education. We can talk about that then. But I have stuff to say about that. Now
Okay. Okay. Well, so I want to back up a little bit because I think the listeners might feel a little bit lost in the weeds at the moment about what it is that we're exactly talking about.
Okay.
I want to before we get super far into like education or testing, I want to kind of establish its relationship to these more general ideas that we started with. And so specifically, this idea of Dymaxyn, I think, is tightly related to this. I'll give you some additional context. It's interesting to me that you and I started talking over Twitter, which is the impetus for having this conversation in the first place a few days ago, because over the weekend I was reading Hansi Freinach's The Listening Society, and The Listening Society is actually very closely related in its more generic goals to the purpose of this show. Although Hansi and I come from a very different perspective. Are you familiar with The Listening Society?
No, please tell me.
Oh, sure. So Hansi Freinach, I believe he's German or Swiss, maybe. He lives in Switzerland. He's in the Swiss Alps. And he wrote this book called The Listening Society. And the basic premise in The Listening Society is that it's hard to totally encapsulate, but it's a broad political theory. And it's a political theory that is basically making the argument that the way to improve quality of life in developed post-industrial nations is to focus on these more subjective qualities of experience that are plaguing our society, right? So basically, if you're thinking about Dymaxyn, if you're thinking about the places in which you can have maximum effect for the minimum amount of energy input, in a place like the United States or in Western Europe, where you have these post-industrial societies with information economies and largely service-based economies, there aren't very many places left where you can really influence change in a very dramatic way on the level of, let's say, improving people's economic conditions, right? So you talked earlier about the effect of economic inequality, right? And its deleterious effects on sort of the social fabric. And that's a well-known fact, right? But in some of the places, specifically Hansi Freinach is looking at a lot of the Nordic countries and using them as an example in this book, The Listening Society, of the kind of places that we want to begin to emulate. And in particular, he talks a lot about, and this is why I think it's related to the work that you're doing. He talks a lot about improvements in childcare, improvements along individual developmental pathways, doing things to reduce population level traumas, and especially also generally just having a more caring, compassionate, sort of sensitive approach to how we structure society, everything down from the education level to parenting to how we set people up in their careers and support them through the welfare state later on. Now, Hansi specifically is coming from, and I think this is partly the European versus American difference. He's a little bit more, I would say, to the left than I would be personally. But while I was reading this book, I was finding a lot of similarity between his ideas and the general project that this show is trying to move people towards, which is more geared towards sort of a psychological and almost spiritual, in some cases, phenomenological approach to transforming society. And I believe that has a lot of closeness to the project that you're working on. And so this is all to summarize for yourself and for the listeners why it is that we're focusing on children and education and childhood development, is because when you reach a sufficient level of, let's say, economic security, and now not everybody has that in these places, but a large majority do, there aren't going to be improvements in people's quality of life and in the health and productivity and functioning of adults that are going to be caused by them having more money, for example. And in fact, if they're dysfunctional, having more money might even exacerbate some of those problems because it'll allow them to act out in more extreme ways. All of that is to say that a lot of the vast improvements that could be made need to be made in this more proactive manner. And also according to Freinak and according to me as well, there needs to be more emphasis on kind of the communal approach to fixing and also preventing some of these problems, rather than putting everything, as Americans especially tend to do, on the individual to figure it out for themselves. And I know there should be a question at the end of this. So,
oh no, that's fine. That's fine. I've got stuff to say, like in response, as
sure.
inspired by the things you said. Unless you want to pose me a direct question as well.
I'll just say all of that is to frame the problem, but you can go ahead and respond if you'd like.
Thank you. So I appreciate this idea of taking things back to basics. Now, obviously, if you can design out a problem, or then you can design activity and infrastructure in such a way that the problem gets sort of phased out, becomes obsolete. And when we look at so this is a word I'm not sure if I've made up or not, but when I use it, so it's the word machinification. And when I say machinification, I'm talking about, referring to any kind of concept in a sort of computery, technical, almost algebraified, I don't know if that's a word either, but, like as though things were a machine, to kind of highlight the structure, the structural element of that. So if we look at the community and we look at childcare within the community, the child care institution, which, from as early child care to, right the way through to adolescence, is very much the regulatory subsystem of the system of the community, because whatever we put into the regulatory subsystem of childcare becomes what eventually the community is. And so it's this cool little
Feedback
flow,
loop.
right? Feedback loop. That's right. So and that is I took a note about what you were saying here. Okay. So that feeds into this idea of sort of like taking things back to basics and stopping the problems before they start. And compassion and the reduction of trauma and healing, that's kind of why we're here, isn't it? It's to heal so that we can come together and ascend the overall vibration and vibrational frequency of our activity to a point where it is extremely functional and people are suffering a lot less. And this really goes hand in hand with the economic element as well, because of course, while we are reducing trauma and uplifting public health and uplifting the general vibe, the zeitgeist, okay, in that type of way, we must be building on that from a solid foundation. You're familiar with how money comes into print, right?
Sure.
But maybe your viewers aren't, or your listeners aren't. So, that whole idea of, the banks will print money, will create money, generate money, and they'll loan it to governments at interest, right? So then that government, distributes that money, however so, things are circulating. But at the end, because the money's been loaned at interest, more money needs to be returned to the banks than what actually exists. So right away, we have the infestation of debt. Boom, whammo, straight into the community, right? And when we're dealing with like large sums of money, it's easy to kind of lose sight of this truth as money circulates and is spent. But then, of course, as the money is exchanged, in return for service, commodities, whatever, like in the process of industry, of course, the debt separates from the money, and the money will be sort of funneled up to the institutions, the businesses, the business owners, et cetera, et cetera. And whereas who gets saddled with the debt? The poor people, right? And then at some point, someone has to default on their loans. It's going to be a poor person. Everybody goes, oh, you should have pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, which, by the way, is a phrase which originated as an expression to refer to something which was impossible, ironically enough. And then, we have this culture of inequality, which greatly undermines really trying not to say public health here, which greatly undermines the happy, happy, good times and the the community as a whole, really, in
Mhm.
its ultimate expression of self. And it is like, so, then if we were to kind of look at just being as kind as we possibly could to our kids without addressing one of the worst things that we as a culture are enforcing on our kids, which is economic inequality, um, I think that that would not be a very stable vehicle for improvement, because you see, the discourse of childcare cannot and indeed must not be removed from the discourse of economics. And the same is true vice versa. A child who, even if they go to the best creche, and we can talk about like the shape that education might take post scarcity, which I think would frame this, what I'm saying right now, quite well. But even, things being as they are, if a child is going to the best creche, which is an Irish term for preschool, if they're going to the best preschool and they have all of their lovely organic meals, but their parents are, stressed out from having to work their 9 to 5, and their neighbors, can't go to a really nice preschool. They're going to a crappy preschool because they're poor. And basically, they're having to witness the effects of income inequality and the destabilizing, really awful effects that that has on community satisfaction and the neighborhood in general. All the mistrust, antisocial behavior, income inequality is linked to teen pregnancies, etc. Um, that is still going to be a real scar on the child's psyche, which is why, these two ideas of childcare and of economic equality are really interlinked.
Hmm. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you've read the Bitcoin Standard, which is sort of like the main book for a lot of Bitcoin evangelists. But the
Yeah.
Bitcoin Standard actually, oddly enough, deals with this argument, I'd say, in like a very extreme form, where they make the case that the printing of money and the devaluation of currency is itself a kind of toxification of our economic system that leads to all these downward negative effects um, in society more broadly. And so a huge aspect of keeping the social fabric intact is actually people having trust in the system itself, and in particular in the soundness of the monetary system. And so when you
Interesting.
devalue the currency, what you're doing is you're sowing distrust within the society. You're also creating all kinds of perverse incentives, and of course, you're stealing from the taxpayers, essentially, and giving
Mm,
it to various kinds of institutions and people within those institutions who are well positioned to sort of receive that money on the front end,
mhm.
rather than later on when it comes down to them.
Well,
Um,
absolutely. And then sorry, no, I'm interrupting you. Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No.
Yeah. Are you sure?
Yeah, yeah.
I feel
Just say
rude.
your piece, because I was going to move on to the next topic.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, I was going to say, and then what do those institutions and business owners do? They turn around, they buy up prisons, they put the community people, they they put the members of the community in the prisons. They decide what they build on the land that we have to live in. They architecture the maze that we have to run through. And so, yeah, it's, they're really, it's like the opposite of emancipation. It's demancipation, it's oppression. Um, an interesting point, you're talking about how we need to have trust in the monetary system. And of course, something like Bitcoin being decentralized, however much energy, it takes to mine Bitcoin, which I don't know exactly how much it is, but I think it's a lot. But with regard to that whole Bitcoin thing, like as great as it is that it's decentralized, any community in which we are competing for resource access through currency or directly, as opposed to, I think the thing that I talked about at the beginning of our little chat, where we're just dealing directly with the resources. We're like, okay, look, this is our community. Obviously we want everyone to be healthy because we don't want our kids to be traumatized, because we love our kids and we want our community to continue well, right? So let's just figure out what's going to go where. We've got all the data here. Everything is streamlined. Everything is understandable. Most stuff is automated, so we don't have to be in that position of competing to sell our labor for any type of currency or any type of access. And, and the few things which aren't automated, I'm sure I personally would be very happy to volunteer to be that person who every second Tuesday of the month goes up and tunes up the machine, if that meant that, we could live in a state of relative abundance. So I think, as great as Bitcoin is and as wonderful as blockchain is, and I think as very useful as blockchain has the potential to be in such a economic setting as the one that I just described, I think any situation in which we have currency and we're outside of like casinos and games and stuff like that, where we're kind of like in that way gamifying a competitive element and trying to put that in between people and what they need, especially when it's completely unnecessary given the tools at our disposal. I think that throws a spanner in the works, and it is very, very problematic because it doesn't address then the issue of systemic inequality, which is the sort of underpinning issue, which then, very much stands to undermine the integrity of any community.
Well, so then my question for you then would be, well, it's not obvious to me that we're at the stage of post-scarcity as you're describing it right now, right? So there are scarce resources. And in fact, due to natural, like I mean, even outside of competition for like status or, who you would like to be life partners with, mates and things like that, which is also inherently scarce, right? There is this other issue of natural resources themselves being scarce, which are needed for particular purposes, or even something as basic as, where you live, right? Real estate is scarce because there can only be one, building or one house, on this particular plot of land. And if I own this particular plot of land and this is where I stay and this is where my family dwells, well, that means that someone else's family, it can't be there. And so there are classes of things which, despite all of our transition to an information economy, and despite any amount of innovation in the space of automation that takes place, are going to be scarce no matter what. And so this is actually a good place of disagreement for us, because I don't see that we're anywhere close to what you're describing. But I would be wonderfully interested in knowing what you see as sort of some of the pathways that we might move that way.
Oh, awesome. That's a great question too. So you're talking about sort of a natural competition, like competition for like sexual selection or sexual selection, like the Snoop Dogg song. Damn, I can't talk today. Yeah, sexual selection, or like where are we going to build what, et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of these are issues that any community is going to face, right? Even like, if you imagine like the ultimate post-scarcity community where everybody's all blissed out and happy and enjoying themselves and painting pictures and frolicking in the fields with their children, etc., you're still going to have an element of competition, right? And I think that that's just something that everybody's just kind of got to deal with, right? And I think the important thing is to be able to be dynamic when it comes to that. I envision, for example, something to deal with that is if you had an app on your phone. And, and again, we have a situation now where all of the regional data is being collected, which is the situation that we have right now, right? Almost all data on all things is being collected, but except for where is that going? Is that then being open access to the members of the community? No. Is it getting hoarded and then sold off to different agencies and companies so they can better learn how to market to us? Yes. The latter is very problematic. However, a good thing about that is that the kind of the infrastructure is there. It just needs to be redistributed. And then we have an interesting conundrum of privacy where, actually this reality that we share has been post-privacy for a very long time. But what it has not been is post-privatization and post-privatized data. So we're operating under this illusion of privacy where we can hide some of our personal information from Jeannie next door, but the NSA, they know us better than our own mom, right? But with that infrastructure already in place of data that being collected, and with then the a move towards post-scarcity to have that data being redistributed so that it's open access. First of all, it does two things, probably does more than two things, but there are two things that it does that I want to talk about. So one is that it really strongly puts the impetus on the community to come together and protect each other, because obviously if all data is because it's already being logged, so now the question is what to do with it. Do we continue letting certain corporations hoard it, or do we let it be free, let it fly free? And if we do the latter, which we're at that crossroads now where we have to choose, then it does raise questions of like, what about the perverts who want to track your kid's route to school, etc. And what it brings into question then is this idea of the attachment village, a term coined, I believe, by Gordon Neufeld, who's a very good psychologist. This idea where a child's the people within a child's community, the people with whom a child are bonded to, are also bonded to each other, and in that way they are communicating with each other, like, oh, I just saw so and so leave school, so you can expect him home in X amount of time, and on the way home he says hi to his neighbor, and the neighbor is like, okay, watching out for you, I've got your back, that kind of thing. And obviously this atmosphere of cooperation greatly reduces the splintering effect that growing up tends to have on children in this modern age, wherein there's the advent of peer orientation. Can I woman-splain peer orientation to you real quick?
Go ahead, keep going.
Okay, so peer orientation is when the bond, because you see, children, they mold their behavior around the behavior, or like, sort of they emulate the behavior of the person with whom their bond of attachment is the strongest. Now, in children who have been in preschool since they were 6 months old, being dropped off at 6 in the morning and picked up at 7 in the evening, very soon their primary bond of attachment becomes with their peers, because in the large groups of children and the children to adult ratio, it's very unlikely that that child is going to be able to form a very strong bond, a very strong kind of like unique with that kind of idea of like, I cherish your heart, with the caregiver in question who is in the preschool. Although a lot of caregivers can do very, very well, I've seen that firsthand. There's just, at the moment, there's not, especially here in Ireland, which is where my experience is of childcare, there's not an adequate adult to child ratio. And so what these children end up doing, they want to give you their heart, they want to be loved, they want to be accepted and validated, and they start trying to give their heart to their peers. And a little 5 or 4-year-old is just as likely to say, I love you, as I hate you, you're not my friend, I don't like your shoes. And then they'll forget about it the next day, but the hurt really cuts deep for these children. And so that is a source of trauma. But even without that, we have the situation where these peers forming these these groups of young people forming these very strong bonds of each other, these kind of self-referential bonds where they start copying each other's behavior, keeps them in this loop, in this feedback loop of immature behavior, and kind of breaks off the traditionally vertical transmission of culture, and makes culture then be a phenomenon which happens kind of in these isolated generational pockets between the youths and the companies which then market to them, making them very easy prey to be manipulated. Which is not to say that there are values that our ancestors had that don't need to just be forgotten, but preferably not forgotten, preferably learned from, understood, and then perhaps built upon or transcended.
And certainly not, imposed by distant corporations.
No, absolutely. And then what was the other thing you were saying about I forget. I had another point, but I forgot what it was. I wanted to talk about plots of land. Did I already do that when you were talking about competition and stuff like that?
I mean, you
Is
briefly
that a few
addressed,
points ago?
yeah, natural competition and the sort of, inherent scarcity to certain kinds of resources and access.
Something that could really help with that, would be if we, let's say this open access, open source, reduced waste, resource-based economy was, it was available on an online platform which anybody can access at any time, right? So, you can have like things like maps of the region in question that you live in with all of like, these little different points. This resource was sourced from here. Here is your local tool library, and the tools came from here, here, and here. This tool library is also a maker space, and the energy used to power that and the types of tools used here are this, that, and this. Are we happy with this as a community? Do we want to have a meeting to discuss this? Blah, blah, blah. And then you could potentially have something like on your phone, where you hold up your phone to this great big plot of land that you want to build on. You hold it up, you scan that plot of land, scan it into your Global Redesign Institute, Dymaxyn, whatever the heck it's going to be called, app. And you see, well, who else is interested in building on this plot of land now? Three neighbors are also interested. So then what do? You go with them, you meet up, you converse, and you figure it out. And I think, in this, we've become so, what's the word? Dependent in a sense, not everybody obviously, but generally there's the sense of we need the government to tell us what to do, we need the boss to tell us what to do, and before that we need the teacher to tell us what to do, which is actually very counter to having a creative experience of learning. But that's we can circle back to that, as you Americans say. But because we get so dependent on this idea of being told what to do, the idea of just like, oh, well, we all want to build on this plot of land, so we'll meet up and figure it out. Let the chips fall where they may. Maybe you don't end up getting to build on that plot of land because your other neighbor has a more compelling reason to do so. Maybe you end up building some sort of community thing. But it's that idea of not to be afraid of confrontation, not to be afraid of a little bit of community disagreement, because the important thing is that there is equality of expression, and that things are getting to where they need to go in terms of like, the reduction of poverty and the issue of resource access, etc. And then, and everything else from that, we need to have a little bit of confidence. I certainly have the confidence that with people's basic needs met, cooperation will become a little bit more easy. You might get two people fist fighting over that plot of land, but it's not like we need to. And this is an issue that I think some people who identify with that idea of futurism face. We don't need to design everything to a T. Oh, what's going to happen when people disagree? Well, here's my 5-point plan of how we're going to manage conflict, and and there's this, that, and the other, and oh, there's going to be a reconditioning center for anyone who's anti. Like, no, like just like chill out, lay the foundation for what needs to happen. It's very clear. Just get things going where they need to. Have a equality oriented resource economy that's optimized towards nonviolence, equality, repeating myself. And then from there, let the people in those communities figure stuff out for themselves, because people aren't stupid. People are disenfranchised, people are traumatized, people are locked into survival mode. But, it's a community issue. So that should be up to the communities, I think.
Hmm. Well, I'm going to have to think about that a little bit longer,
Okay.
because that, then you're getting into issues of like governance and, private property and how exactly all of that gets sorted out. And, there are lots of experiments that go on with that, but there are also, I would say, naturally evolved systems for managing some of those things. One example of that would be like the tort system, for example, which is, the system of English common law was developed in a very naturalistic way, and sort of had a kind of natural evolution to it. And so that's actually a good example of a not top-down thing, of a sort of bottom-up process, a historical process, and one that's grounded in a particular legal tradition, but still. What I wanted to return to, and we've been kind of we've been weaving in and out of it, but I really wanted to put some emphasis on this point. I wanted to return to something you said earlier, which is the child development and childcare as a subsystem for regulating the society, which you've already talked about in your last point here, which is that if you have good systems in place for developing independent, creative, cooperative adults, then the outflows in terms of benefits to the functioning of your society later on are tremendous, right? Because you now have happier, healthier, more productive adults who then go on to do more interesting things, more creative things with their lives. And there's less conflict also as a result of that. And so I wanted to zoom in then on a term that you use a lot in your work and that I think you've already mentioned at least once or twice in this conversation, which is attachment systems. So how does your understanding of attachment, which you talked about a little bit in the example you gave of peer-to-peer, association or learning, how does that influence your understanding of this sort of project? Because I think it's something that's crucial when we're thinking about the full expression of grown adults, when we're thinking about ways to reduce trauma in particular, and especially when you consider the fact that a lot of the economic conditions that we're under are causing more unconventional family styles, more, again, as you alluded to earlier, just children being separated from their primary caregivers, or not being given adequate attention because of the fact that they're put through these systems, and also because of the demands that are made upon families. I just want to delve deeper into this particular point here of attachment and the way that it interacts with all of these things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think that's very, very interesting, because attachment is kind of the through line of all of this, isn't it? Attachment is what attaches all of the different concepts together. So maybe I can answer you by kind of painting you a little narrative. I feel like that's the best way that I could kind of address those, those different concepts, but along the through line of attachment. So imagine then that we have that resource based, so with the focus being on the organization, allocation, production, distribution, and manufacturing. I think I already said manufacturing, and recycling of resources. That's the focus, right? A resource based, reduced waste, meaning that perhaps the products are designed with the end in mind, so that once they have they finish doing what they need to do, the parts are then sent back to the the manufacturing hub or whatever it is. So in that way, we're greatly reducing waste. Also, things being made, like with mycelium and stuff, which is not plastic, and not radioactive either. So if we have a resource-based, reduced waste, open source, and then there we can think a little bit about blockchain, the idea that every time a community member contributes to the building of this economy, which should very much continue to be like an emergent organic thing, and in that way be the best kind of dynamic support system for a culture which is also emergent and dynamic and growing. So, and with blockchain, if people are kind of contributing to that and helping things grow, then we can always kind of cut back and say, oh, well, where did this idea come in and how has it been influenced since then? So open source, so resource-based, reduced waste, open source, open access, which we've talked about already, all of the regional data being made available for the people who live in the region so that they can give their informed consent as to policy, etc. So if we have a resource-based, reduced waste, open access, and open source cybernetic economy, and cybernetic is just basically, it's all of that stuff. It's a made-up word. But then again, all words are made up, and now I'm confusing myself. If we have that kind of economy anyway, so let's imagine that we've got a good state of, I'm just going to go ahead and say, okay, of public health, but of public health in the sense that it is it's real, it's genuine. People of the public are feeling satisfied with the level of health that their community supports them to have. Then you can imagine that, for example, the school system, because, now let's say so many things which keep the economy going, so many aspects of household management are automated. We then don't have a automated, but still with but like automated, so like human labor doesn't need to be involved, but automated and made to be open access and open source, so that human inspiration is very much involved. And I mean, if you've ever seen a painting that was painted by somebody who was stressed out about not meeting their deadline and not getting to feed their kid, and a painting that was painted by somebody who felt beautifully inspired and motivated out of love, you can get the idea of the different types of communities that we're talking about here. One that relies on human labor, human fear-based labor, and human inspiration. So because parents now are largely free of that daily grind, there's not really any need to keep the school as like a little unit where the children are kind of left and taught at, which, we can touch, because I've been kind of like tiptoeing around that idea, but that has more to do with, like, we can go back to that anyway. So there's no real need to kind of relegate or push the whole education system into like a little building and have that be where children are raised to be productive members of the labor force. Instead, what we want to do in this inspiration, cooperation driven community is to open up the school so that the school becomes the community, and in that way open up the community so it is inviting to the young people. So you could maybe have in your local tool library, there's a maker space where children can go and make stuff and learn about how stuff is made in their community. The local horticultural hub has got community gardens where children can go and, speak with the different people who live in the garden. There's going to be plenty of activities there waiting to engage them. You can have like centers of science, centers of art, basically whatever you can imagine being part of a healthy community. Should then be welcoming and opening for children and young people to step into that, and in that way step into their community and start to learn how to step into their power as an active neighbor in the neighborhood. And this is where we come into attachment, where the attachment bonds, instead of being like fragmented in the state of systemically manufactured competition as enforced by having any kind of monetary system at all. And then, and everything arising from there. We have the children are sectioned off over here. The parents are sectioned off over here. The aunts and uncles are sectioned off over here. Everything is all kind of like disparate. We have this attachment village. And at this point, we can have a greater level of community satisfaction. And then what have I put over here? Yeah, well, and then here we can come back to this thing that I've been wanting to bring up for a minute, which is this idea of learning versus teaching. When children are in school and they are being taught, a lot of the time there's this situation in which they are not, like, they're being taught stuff, sure, and that's great, but these lessons in science and maths and art and music are all kind of coming hand in hand with this idea of submitting to authority. And as I think it was Doris Lessing who said, at the moment, I think, okay, I don't remember the quote 100%, but she basically said something like, what should be said to every school-age child and repeated often so that they don't forget, is that at the moment we do not have a system of education which is not also a system of indoctrination. And this is to be expected when we need young people to grow up and become part of the labor force. However, if we want young people to grow up and become part of the inspiration force, it would make so much more sense then to have a situation in which they are, like I said, invited into the community. You'd still have like gym halls and like special labs, which were prepared to, uphold the health and safety regulation standards for them to mess around with Bunsen burners and stuff like that. But can you imagine like a city or like a community, a neighborhood, which is basically transformed into a university campus, but for kids of all ages? And in that way, the family, like the organic pace of the family, is upheld because, I mean, as a mom, there have been so many times when like my kid is having an emotional breakdown over not being able to have like an extra whatever with her breakfast. Okay, she doesn't actually have emotional breakdowns. Okay, full disclosure, I'm not an awful parent, but you know, like something is happening. She needs something to be dealt with. And I have to choose between, well, you have to get out the door, otherwise you're going to be late for school, or being like, okay, sweetheart, let's talk about it. What is your unmet need right now? So in a situation in which, you know, the school kind of opened up and kind of like the seeds of education and inspiration, instead of all kind of being crammed into this one plot of an educational system institution, they're scattered across the community, and then that way they're informing the development of the community as well, and reminding everyone in the community about how much we need to orient our community to the support of the emerging future community, which is our children. And in that kind of situation, you know, a kid, say an 8-year-old kid, could be like, okay, tomorrow I want to have a bit of a chill morning, just hanging out, playing with my dolls. But then in the afternoon, I want to have I want to have a piano lesson over here. I want to go and like spend some time in the community garden afterwards. Then I want to go and do some science experiments at the science hall afterwards, whatever it might be. And you can like be booking into slots, etc., as parents and as families. And in that way, you know, like families are meeting each other. Maybe the parents want to come along, maybe they don't, but there's just this uh a much greater opportunity, I think, for inspiration, for communication, cooperation, and, you know, all of this in this enhanced attachment, voluntary attachment, where
Mm.
you're going places where you want to be, and you're seeing and you're learning things that you want to learn about. And instead of just kind of, you know, being just put wherever a system that wasn't designed for you or your community is forcing you to be.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. I had an interview that I did with uh, British philosopher Nina Power, which will actually be out. It hasn't been released yet, but it will be out before this episode airs, for those who are listening to this in the future, in which we talk about Ivan Illich, who is one of his more famous works is Deschooling Society, which is a term that he uses for that's very similar to this concept that you're talking about, which is sort of for Ivan Illich was at least deinstitutionalizing education and really breaking away from this sort of centralized model,
Mm.
and imagining alternative forms of education that might take place, which there are many natural experiments going on with that right now, because due to COVID, many people have decided to pull their children out of the public schools, which are dysfunctional, and try alternative, learning strategies, whether that's homeschooling or learning pods or, private tutoring if they can afford that. There are all sorts of interesting things happening in that space. One of the things I wanted to bring up with regard to attachment, though, was I think there's something more fundamental here than just simply the quantity and the quality. I mean, the quality of the relationships is really what you're talking about, but more fundamental than the quantity of relationships, or the way in which they're supported throughout the community, which is sort of the psychological angle to it. And that is to say that in developmental psychology, when we think about attachment patterns in children, what we're actually talking about is the way in which the child relates themselves to the outside world, broadly speaking. There's always an object of attachment, even in the case of a caregiver scenario. The way that that's sort of conceptualized is a subject object relationship. Now, of course, a mature attachment style recognizes that that it's not an object, that what you've encountered is a secondary subject. That being said, when we're talking about things like cooperation or fear response, or even just the basic axis of
Mm.
uh, of exploration versus, let's say, a non-exploratory or a fear-based mentality. Um, all of that is built into sort of the attachment styles that a child develops, usually very, very early on, like within the first 7 years of life.
Mm-hmm.
And if something goes wrong during those stages, it can become very difficult to then pull them out of that, even if they get proper support later on, because of how deeply that's ingrained in their conception of self and their conception of others. And so this is one of those key areas that can really be a massive point of improvement in preventing those kinds of things from happening. Because when you look at, say, things like aggression, or you look at uncooperative behavior, all these things that we sort of view as antisocial, a lot of those are grounded in a sort of dysfunctional attachment style, which gets developed, unfortunately, very early on, when there's very minimal control by the child themselves over how these things play out.
Mm.
So I wanted to then ask you, like, do you imagine things like psychological services or kinds of widespread interventions on the level of not only traditional psychotherapy methods, but also things like physical engagement, like getting people, and in particular children, again, more physically embodied, and different kinds of alternative methods, things like meditation, for example. Would these be all sort of involved in the kind of planning or the formation of this educational curriculum that you are imagining would go along with this sort of rearrangement of society?
Oh, cool. Well, when I imagine the rearrangement of society, I kind of stop at imagining, at trying to set a good foundation for then society to go forth and do its own thing. And within that, I've got all sorts of my own ideas about like what the optimum thing would be. But I think it's very important. Well, I want to make it very, very clear that with the Global Redesign Institute, what that means for me and Dymaxon, my idea, like what I'm trying to do, is just to give humanity um, a good jumping off point to then figure stuff out for themselves. Well, for itself, for people to figure stuff out for themselves. And then sort of let the chips fall where they may, because I think the end is pre-existent in the means. And if you want to have that's a Martin Luther King quote, if you want to have a situation, a future in which there is a high degree of liberty, it needs to arise. It needs to arise as freely as possible. So that's just my little disclaimer. Okay, now. But what was the word that you said? It wasn't a syllabus, but you used a similar kind of word
It's a
just there, like
syllabus.
not a
Uh,
syllabus, but you're like a curriculum,
oh, okay.
right? I don't know if that's a similar word, but I associate the two. So yeah, and you were saying about, I think absolutely, yeah, like a meditation, yoga, and connection with nature should all be, very should all factor in very greatly in a child's development. Absolutely. Yeah, of course. And, the degree to which that needs to happen will be specific to each and every child, but certainly, it's my personal dream to open up a school one day. I'm a couple of qualifications away from doing that, but I'm on my way to having all of those qualifications to then not be able to do it because I can't afford it. No, sorry, that's negative self-talk. The dream is there, and the dream is that I'd open up my own school, and it would be like half just like regular school, right? So like just like a creche. Sorry, like a preschool. It would probably be a preschool, and then you'd have but it'd also be a rescue farm, and like lessons would be outdoors as much as possible. You'd have like like lesson time allocated to just freestyling out in the nature, getting your hands dirty, seeing what you wanted to come up with, but always with a general kind of support from the facilitators. It wouldn't just because children, there's some, I can't reference the study now, but there have been studies done in which it showed that children, when becoming bored, they revert to sadistic aggression. So I know I'm not talking about just all like sending the kids out into a field and be like, see you later, kids, enjoy being free. Because I think that can be very problematic, not least because of that idea of peer orientation. In order to develop secure And functional attachment styles, a very important thing which is needed for that is guidance. So whereas when it comes to learning how to paint a picture, or learning how to I don't know, how to write, or even developing a relationship with maths and numbers, in science, it's very important to kind of you know like allow the child to make that discovery process there, so they can have all of that positive creative association with it, and then in that way really do justice to the genius that we're all imbued with as children, that willingness to try doing things differently. I haven't met a single child in my whole experience of working with children. I've never met a single child who was not in some way a creative genius, just by virtue of wanting to experiment and do things a little bit differently and getting all weird and silly with it, right? But when it comes to the development of attachment style, how we communicate with each other, it's very important that there is like a wise, empathetic, non-violent, in the sense of like force of truth. Obviously, it goes without saying we don't want to be hitting our kids, but more than that, we want to be coming at them with respect. We want to be tailoring our communication specifically to meet the needs of the individual in question, so that they feel seen and understood and listened to and appreciated. And we, as caregivers, want to be showcasing all of these different ways of interacting respectfully and of being functionally and supporting functional attachment, so that then the children can, first of all, form a bond with us because we're so nice and they like us so much. And then also, what's the word, which isn't assimilate and isn't copy, emulate. Emulate our behaviors, because children who have kind of been left to their own devices amongst their peers a little bit too much and become peer oriented are more likely, I can't reference the study, but there is one, and I think you can find it if you go to, I think, the psychologist Gordon Neufeld's website, or maybe even Dr. Gabor Mate has done some stuff about this as well. Children who are more peer oriented are much more likely to then in later life, adolescence, and in adulthood, seek out primarily more primitive forms of attachment. So they're going to be trying to attach to the people they care about, sexually and through validation. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they're going to be doing that more than trying to form an intellectual and emotional bond with that person. Because again, they're kind of locked in that immature feedback loop, right? And so definitely having a type of community in which education is kind of facilitated. Academic education is like facilitated. Creative education is like an exploratory process with the support, with the attentive but also respectful support of adults, and where emotional development and attachment styles is something that children are guided through, would greatly reduce, I feel, is pretty fair to say, would greatly reduce the likelihood of dysfunctional attachment styles in later life.
Well, that was a great summary. So I wanted to add in a disclaimer, which is weird. I don't feel like I should have to add in a disclaimer, but I feel like I might, just because this episode is so unusual as compared to the normal episodes that we're usually doing. Which is that we don't on the show tend to talk a lot about children and childhood and issues surrounding development. And that's just sort of the nature of the show. It's a political philosophy show, so we end up talking about a lot of adult concerns and adult topics. But for those of you who are still listening, and if you're listening this far into it, I assume you think this is worthwhile. I just want to make it clear that the reason why we're putting so much emphasis on this is because this is an area where you can get vast improvements with a small amount of investment, relative to the amount of at least money that you need to spend. Now, you do need to spend other things. You need to spend things like care and attention, which, again, we've talked about the many ways in which society and our economic system might be redesigned to allocate more of those things more effectively. But that is kind of the goal of what we're doing. And it ties into some of the other projects that we've featured on the show, things like Game B, which is has a very similar vein to this. I don't know if you're familiar with Game B.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Game B people are also trying to sort of establish kind of at the localist levels and community levels, rearrangements for a multitude of systems, and really trying to imagine society in a holistic sense. And that's really like the through line I see through all these things we've been talking about. Your work with the Global Redesign Institute, even the Listening Society that I mentioned earlier, as well as Game B. All of these are holistic approaches to understanding how humans could be living, right? And none of them have yet, implemented a 100% concrete, working, functional instantiation of these ideas that we're talking about. But the important thing is that we're having these conversations about these ideas, and we're getting to the point where there's enough critical mass of people who are interested in them that we're approaching the level at which we can start to conduct small scale experiments to try to see if some of these will be able to flesh out. So I wanted to ask you then, Anna, you have a GoFundMe that's you've set up for the Global Redesign Institute.
Yeah.
And it describes its purpose is raising money for this game. And so I wanted to then ask you, what's going on with this game? Like, why did you decide that a game was important to be implemented? I know that you have some grant funding, but you're also, of course, doing some crowdfunding for it as well. What is it that made you and your partner with the Global Redesign Institute, Casper, decide to try to carry this project forward in the form of a game?
Okay. So I had thought that that I'd shut down the GoFundMe page, but I guess it's still there.
Oh
I
no.
No, that's totally fine. If anybody watching this right now is like, oh, hey, I want to dump a bunch of cold hard cash into go right ahead. But I thought I'd shut it down because my idea was to just try and exclusively apply for grants.
Well,
So the Global Redesign Institute, no, but I still want to do the game. I just thought I'd try and apply exclusively for grants to do it because the GoFundMe wasn't getting any traction. And then I had some of my low income neighbors be like, oh, hey, I'll put in a tenner. And I was like, you need that tenner for your food. And basically at no point did some big Oliver Warbucks come along and say, hey, this sounds like exactly the kind of thing that doesn't undermine the way I've lived my life. So here, have my fortune. Which, was a long shot, but you never know. The reason why, I thought that the Global Redesign Institute, Dymaxon, could have a game or could start off as a game would be to have a platform or attraverso, how do we say attraverso in English? A platform through which communities could begin to kind of train themselves up in preparation for having, their economic management returned to them. So the idea is basically it would be a simulation game of the real thing in which you have a little map of your region and you can go through your region and tune things up and see what needs to be done. So you might hover over your local florist. And I thought it'd be kind of cool to have a companion app as well. So like you could then physically go out to your local florist and hold up your phone. But
it's
maybe
like Pokemon Go for flowers.
Yeah, basically. And you hold up your phone and you kind of like you get your florists, or maybe just if we're having it in game, it'll be a simulation of you doing this, and then as things develop, that can be something that we bring into real life. But so you look at your florist and then you pass them through the filters of functional criteria. So, how in Snapchat you have like a cute dog face filter, but you also have like a flower princess filter. I don't personally have Snapchat, but I hear that's what's going on with the Snapchat, right? So then you would have like a sustainability filter, a regenerativity filter. Oh gosh, I don't know, things being locally sourced filter. and you could pass you could pass whatever institution it is that you're looking at through all of these filters and see what comes out the other side. Now, this is something that I really like, right? Even if the thing, first of all, you can choose which filters you pass it through. You can be like, regenerativity filter, screw that, we'll just stick with sustainability, right? And or you could pass it through all the filters. And if you don't like what comes out the other side in game, you can just say, screw it, I'm going to freestyle. While you're in the game, and you're looking at, oh, where am I going to build, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have like a little guy like Clippy, remember from Microsoft Word? Hey, it looks like you're trying to build a Center for Disease Control. Do you want help? And if you say yes, it can be like, okay, well, these are the materials which are locally available. These are the materials which are most structurally sound. These are the different types of ways that you could build the building in order for it to be most environmentally resistant, sustainable, et cetera, whatever, right? And you can be like, okay, thanks. I'll take this bit of that advice, this bit of this advice. I don't want to get the most optimum here because I like the look of this one more here. Or you can be like, screw you, Clippy. I know what I'm doing. Thank you very much. And the designs, which your saved work basically is going to then be sent back to the servers via blockchain and then uploaded in real time onto a continuously updated map of the region in question. And then this is where the multiplayer element comes in, and other people who are playing this, I like the idea of every region in the world having a version of this to play and to kind of train up with. So anyway, so other people in your region who are also playing the game can like go into your map just to view it and be like, oh, hey, this is pretty cool. They can offer you to collaborate, and then you open up your own map together and you start building stuff like that together. And in that way, it's training communities to kind of, to step into their own power as proactive members of a neighborhood. And what I like about it is that if you follow all of the criteria and you do exactly what Clippy tells you to do, you're learning, right? You're learning about this, that, and the other. And that prepares you well for when we roll out Dymaxyn, the economy app, right? And at some point in the future, when everybody gets on board and the military are like, we're not going to bomb this. But then if you just decide to totally freestyle it, and if at the end of it your design is well liked by the community, then it still gets uploaded onto the continuously updated map. And in this way, we're really facilitating at a design level, we're really facilitating true democracy, where you're not beyond just voting on pre-established referendums or even on community decided referendums. We're uplifting the creative power of the individual. I think it was Tim somebody who said that design is too important to be left to the experts. And I wholeheartedly agree. So yeah, we're uplifting like the creative agency of the individual for the sake of the community. And that's the part of it that I'm most passionate about.
What do you think is the future of the Global Redesign Institute?
See, I have a pessimistic streak. But I guess you're saying, like, what would I like the future of the Global Redesign Institute to be?
Or where do you see it headed?
Either or. Okay, gosh. Well, if I quell my the aspects of my disposition which are pessimistic, I would like to say that, everybody it'll be taken up, the game will be distributed in a few communities to start with. It will generally uplift the zeitgeist in terms of the regions in question, in terms of creative and dynamic engagement in their own management, and generate the sense of empowerment, whereupon then it can be developed into, all regional data will be like let's say, I'd like to say, maybe governments are like, you know what, it's been great being a bunch of gosh darn pirates and depleting the earth's resources, but it's not sustainable, so here, have your data back, right? And then so we can get the data required to to bring the Global Redesign Institute into the real world as a means of economic management for communities, by communities.
Mhm.
And then, we can, and then, I would expect then for that to give rise to the various elements of a happy culture that we've already discussed. And, failing that, I think if the game is just distributed and if it is well received, then I expect that would create a demand for something similar to happen, in the actual world, away from the simulation. And, hopefully that demand would be met with cooperation and creativity and a will to get along. I like to back the underdog in that way, and I like to have faith in people generally, and I also like to think. I like to think that you always have, as a scientist, you always have to allow for the scientific possibility that the unlikely thing will happen. And you never know, really. Like, humans can be so crazy and weird. You never know when singing one song lyric will trigger an entire emotional response in somebody else. So I like to think that things will go smoothly in that sort of way. And failing that,
Well,
who knows?
I've been accused of putting the onus on people to have a positive vision, and I'm not an optimist supremacist. Like, I don't believe that every answer needs to be optimistic.
Right.
So, what is your fear? I mean, I don't even know how you would even define failure, other than maybe everyone in who's alive in the world forgetting about this idea. Like, I guess that would be considered failure. But as long as it's living in the minds of people, then, could it really be over?
I don't think so. I think what there's a okay. Do you play computer games?
I play a very small number of computer games.
Have you ever played Metal Gear Solid?
No.
Okay, Metal Gear Solid is probably one of the most masterful, amazing computer games ever created.
That's high
And
praise. I might have to try it now.
honestly, you really, really should. It's one of those things that, like, there are loads of games, but the overall arc, the poetry involved in it, the reflection of the military-industrial complex, and oh, it's just gorgeous. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And anyway, I bring it up because there is a song that was written especially for, I think it was the third one, which is Peace Walker, which is set in Costa Rica. And it's this beautiful, beautiful song performed by Donna Burke. I can link it to you afterwards. But it's called When Heavens Divide. And there's a line in it which is I'm sorry, I'm gonna try and not just blah my way through all of my slip ups and just try and get my words right the first time. The line is leaving a trace for love to find a way. And I think that's really lovely because you see I don't know how familiar you are with Stoic philosophy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm,
so
I'm familiar with Stoicism.
you know that idea of, like, all that the Stoic can really seek to do is to aim the arrow straight and true, and whether or not it hits the target is very much subject to the winds of chance, or whether somebody jumps in the way at the last minute or whatever. Um, and so I know that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to give as much as I am able to give towards this idea, in the hope that it will catch on, or in the hope that I will, be able to get the resources to take it along somewhere, to take it along its development as much as possible, and to sort of continue to persevere in that hopeful, community-oriented way.
Mm.
And if I walk out of the door tomorrow and get hit by a fridge, or not hit by a
A
fridge.
flying
I was like,
fridge.
I was gonna say someone drops a fridge on me,
Oh,
right? Or get hit by a bus if you want to be less weird about it. Then so be it. But I think the idea is just that, to quote Martin Luther King, if you can't fly, then run. And if you can't run, then walk. And if you can't do that, then crawl. But you have to keep on moving forward.
Yes. And so, in the spirit of moving forward and continuing to spread the idea, which is hopefully something that we're going to be doing with this conversation here, is spreading this idea to more people. For those who are listening and want to look into it further, or maybe even potentially get involved with your work, where can they find out more information about the Global Redesign Institute?
I have a blog, and I think it is www.globaldesigninstitute.wordpress.com. And but I will double check that, and then if you want, you can put that in the actual one, just in case that's wrong, into the description. And if there's a contact form on there, and anyone is very, very welcome to reach out to me through that. I also have Twitter and Instagram, and yeah, just like any kind of involvement, even if you just want to shoot the shit, like I generally tend to be up for a chat. So yeah.
What's your at?
Twitter? Oh gosh, I don't know. I don't know. I think it might be Space Flower with some variation of 3s for ease, but
I've got it pulled up here. It's space
okay.
_flower with 3s in place of each of the e's.
Yes.
So for those of you who are looking, she might be hard to find on Twitter otherwise. So anyway, I wanted to just get the ad in there.
Thank you.
Well, Anna, this has been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today and to tell everyone about your project. I'm always interested in interviewing people who have interesting projects, interesting ideas going on for the future of society. Yeah, this has been a great time.
Thank you. I've had a wonderful time as well. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a good day.
You as well.